Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Rapp, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Strategy in the Office of Alumni Relations. And I organize lots of career programs and offer career coaching and oversee our NUSource networking platform. I'm very happy to have you here. I'm excited that you're joining us to learn more about this exciting topic of generative AI and how it can be a helpful tool for career development, the job search, and more. I think Lance Eaton, our speaker, is our ideal guide for helping us navigate this landscape and help us get started using these tools and exploring. Lance is the Director of Faculty Development and Innovation at College Unbound, a part-time instructor at North Shore Community College, and a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, with a dissertation that focuses on how scholars engage in academic piracy. His work engages with the possibility of digital tools for expanding teaching and learning communities while considering the various deep issues and questions that educational technologies open up for students, faculty, and higher education as a whole. Lance has given talks, written about, and presented at conferences on AI generative tools in education, academic piracy, open access, open educational resources, open pedagogy, hybrid flexible learning, and digital service learning. His musings, reflections, and ramblings can be found on his blog by anyothernerd.com. And before I hand it over to him, I want to mention that something new that we're trying is to stop at 1 o'clock as planned, but if anyone that wants to stay on just for some networking, we'll do that for about 10 minutes after 1 o'clock, just as a way to create some interaction in this virtual world. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Lance.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to be in this space with you. I'm super excited to be here. I will occasionally have to slow down or take a pause. I am on, I think, day 6 of COVID, and it knocked me off my feet. So I appreciate the patience with that. I'm going to share my screen, and can I get a thumbs up if you can see the slide? All right, I see that. And just give me one more second to make sure I can see some of the folks here and also the chat. Awesome. All right. So hey, y'all. I'm Lance Eaton. I'm excited here to discuss with you the role of AI in work and where it is, where it might be headed, and what sense we can make out of it. Today's talk is an extension of work I've been doing for about 15 years or so, both in education and technology. And particularly, I'm thinking about how the digital age changes the game and how we pursue jobs and build our professional identity. I've been doing workshops on building professional digital identities using social media and other practices for probably over a decade. And well, the arrival of generative AI obviously has had me thinking a lot about what this tool means as we pursue and prepare for careers. So let's get started. So what are we doing today? I think first, we're going to ground our talk in an acknowledgement about the concerns of generative AI. Then we're going to focus on, get into the meat of the conversation, which is AI and knowledge work and how those fit together. And then we can talk about the ways we can leverage AI in the job seeking process. And then we'll have some final considerations and, of course, time for questions. I also want folks to know that all of the materials, these slides, there's a bunch of resources, they're all covered with what's called a Creative Commons license. In this case, it's a attribution and share alike. The resource link that you see at the bottom of the screen and that I'm putting into the chat right now. This will give you access to what I call is the annotated slide deck. This will be a Google Doc that will have the slides, the text that I'm going to say, and for each slide, often resources or annotations. That might be links to further check out. That might be prompts to try. That might be some results I've gotten from ChatGPT or other generative AI, just to give you a sense of what to expect. All right. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. This presentation was prepared using generative tools, and I acknowledge that many generative AI tools do not respect the individual rights of authors and artists and ignore concerns over copyright and intellectual property in the training of the system. Additionally, I acknowledge many AI systems are trained in part through exploitation of precarious workers in the global south. Also, I recognize that the structures to support the expanse of AI rests on continued large-scale extraction of resources from environments and methods that have long effects on local populations. And in the end, many of those resources, such as hardware, are often causing further harm in global climate change and environmental degradation, particularly indirectly for global south and communities that are historically or presently marginalized. In this work, I specifically use generative AI as a collaborative exercise to test out some ideas about its usage, better understand the tool, and may also demonstrate some of the ways it generates answers. So let's first take a look at how generative AI connects with knowledge work that I'm sure everybody here is doing or pursuing or working with students to do. Need that water, hold on. My apologies. Okay, so here are some of the most currently popular tools out there, and I'm actually curious for this group. I'm going to guess that everybody has heard of ChatGPT, but for the next 30 seconds, right? For the next 30 seconds, it's gonna be a little interactive here. I'm gonna ask you to type into the chat this list that you see here. What are the ones here that you haven't heard? So don't hit enter yet. I just want folks to, for 30 seconds, type of this list, which ones have you not heard of? And then when I say enter, we're all gonna enter at once. So we're gonna do this little cascade, right? So I'm gonna give you, like I said, 30 seconds. And you're gonna write down which of these tools, these generative AI tools, that you have not heard of. All right, I'm gonna do on the count of 3, 2, 1, hit enter. All right, look at that. Look at that waterfall, right? So we see a lot of folks have not heard of Claude or Midjourney, DALL-E. I'm seeing a lot of DALL-E. Yep. Bard. Really does feel like Midjourney, DALL-E, and Bard are the big ones, right? Now that's quite a variety there. Thank you for participating in that, right? Just to kind of get a sense that like we're all new in learning this, right? Given that, anybody that does know any of these, do you want to try to give a 1 to 2 sentence description? And again, feel free to put it into the chat. And of course, no cheating, right? No going over to ChatGPT to ask, hey, give me a 1 to 2 sentence description of Midjourney or Claude. I know at least one person was probably thinking of that. It's okay, no judgment. But if anybody wants to take a stab, this is just write it and enter it. You don't have to, we're not gonna do the waterfall part. So while folks are doing that, I'll keep going here. These tools are becoming increasingly ubiquitous, and while some folks aren't as familiar with all of these tools, they have become a lot more present in our day-to-day lives, whether we realize it or not. A good example of that is Bard, which is Google's AI tool. And it's become more present because if you start to move around in Google Spaces, you'll start to see there's more generative AI tools. In fact, in Google Slides, which I use to make this slide deck, this image was generated by Google Slides, right? By Google's AI tool. So if you look in the bottom left corner, it says image generated by Google Slides. So now within a slide deck in Google, you can actually have it generate images for you. You can write out a description and it will actually generate that. So what I want to point out that is distinct about these tools and really the overall hype that we're experiencing in the last 10 months that feels different from prior cycles. The first is that AI this AI is different from the AI that we've been using for the last decade, right? Many of us have interacted with Siri or Alexa or other advanced recommendation systems. These didn't feel as impressive or easy to use right out of the box. But generative AI that can generate text, audio, image, video through the use of everyday language, that feels different because of its ease of use. So what do I mean by ease of use? Well, we're several years in to the launch of like the metaverse. Uh, and can anybody really tell me what the metaverse is? Have you visited it? I'm still confused, and I like to think I'm fairly competent in these types of things. Like the metaverse exists and was launched, and yet nobody really knows what or can explain it in a clear, easy way that somebody can just get in and use, right? The lift to figure out what the metaverse is and how to access it, how to create in it or with it, why it would be better than that than anything else, like that's a lot to figure out. By contrast, generative AI, it comes to us in the form of a chat box, something that's been around for decades, to which we're quite familiar with, right? We see a text box on a computer, on a screen, and we know what to do. We enter text. That's that's what all of these things did well right out of the gate. All of these tools that are up here on the screen. Um, it took something terribly complex, generative AI, and nuanced, and made it usable in a text box. And that's a devilishly easy invitation, right? That makes it much easier. Like I can spend 5 minutes sitting down with, I absolutely love her. I can sit down with my mom, who sometimes has certain challenges with technologies, and she can get this. Like she can get it. Now she has to like figure out whether to trust the answers or not, but she can use it. Like that's the quickness of a tool like this. And just for clarity, it doesn't look like anybody really took me up on the offer for like what these tools are. So I'll give a quick explanation. That's fine. Claude and ChatGPT are text-based AI chatbots that you can converse with back and forth, and that's primarily what they do. You provide a prompt, as we'll talk about later, and it provides responses in the form of text. Bing and Bard are very similar, but they're both by Microsoft and Google, and they are embedded tools that you're going to find increasingly throughout the Google suite. And so they both do that text thing, but as we can see, they do image and other things. DALL-E and Midjourney are image generators. So you can put in a description and it will generate a hyper-realistic picture. If you have a chance to start looking at some of the things created by DALL-E and Midjourney, it'll blow your mind in how well it creates. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of cases where it creates crap, but it also does a lot of real cool things. And learning how to draw it out, how to maximize the better quality is some of the things that people have been practicing and figuring out over the last 10 months. Okay, so the fact is there are thousands of generative AI tools out there, and I'd encourage you to do some research to find the ones that are right for you and your work. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to probably stick primarily talking about ChatGPT because that's the perfect entry tool for folks to get comfortable, to learn about, start to use, and there's lots of different ways you can leverage, as you'll see with different example prompts that I'm going to show you. I've included in the resources that annotated slide deck. Again, I'll throw it into the chat just for some folks that came in late. I've included in there breakdowns of some of the different tools. So the ones I just talked about, all of these tools, these are tools that I might be interested or intrigued in because of my work in academia, and then other tools that I've come across that I think are interested in the creative space of one way or another. So again, I'm kind of curious, is anybody on this chat, have you heard of any of these tools? And if you've heard of it, then you put it into the chat and hit enter. So again, I'll give a few seconds for folks. If any of these tools you've heard of, maybe even played of. All right, we see an otter.ai. It's a really great one around transcriptions or summarizing transcriptions. Elicit, really great one for research. Site.ai, another one. Yep. Another good one for research. Kimberly's pulling ahead, folks. I don't know. Anybody else? It's totally fine. It's not a competition except when it is, right? No. So there's additional information about all of these, just as there's a nice table to kind of learn a little bit more about. And these tools are, these tools are gaining more attention and interest in academia. And while I think some schools will start to use them more consistently going forward, I also don't think, they'll be the tools we'll be using in 5 years. We're in this like rapid diffusion of AI tools stage right now, and we have been for the last 10 months. Every day, I see at least 10 new tools that come up in my feeds about, oh, this does this and this does this. And some of them are interesting. A lot of them don't feel like they're anything more than like something superimposed on like ChatGPT or some of the other, or Claude or some of the other ones. What I think we'll see in the next 2 years is a rapid consolidation of all of these tools as the larger companies, mainly those like Google and Microsoft, Apple and Facebook, as they start to like scoop them up and acquire them. And I think those are going to be the places where we see the most robust AI tools come about, because one of the things that's needed for a AI tool to be really good is to have access to a large language model, as somebody referenced in the chat, that is like a huge data set, and a data set that can be personalized and customized. And if there's anything we know about Google or Microsoft, Facebook, etc., like they all have massive amounts of information about each of us. And so in order for AI to be really useful, it has to be contextualized. And the only way it gets contextualized is with data. So that's most likely what we will see over the next few years, but it's worth seeing the emphasis of different tools and what they bring out, and understanding like what they're trying to help folks understand about how you can use generative AI. So before one can really manage or really maximize the benefits of generative AI, one also has to have this critical eye to it. It's only as intelligent as the questions you ask, and the answers that you can understand enough to be critical of. So what do I mean by that? AI doesn't answer questions in the way that you or I do. It doesn't think holistically about words and sentences that you use to ask it something, right? It's not sitting there hearing me. If I ask it a question, it's not looking at that question and thinking about that holistically. Instead, it uses a heck of a lot of math to calculate the probable relationships across different bits and parts of words, not even entire words themselves. So it calculates the relationships. It calculates those relationships and looks within its larger data model, which in this case is a large language model, for its own patterns, and tries to produce a probable answer. And it does so with unerring confidence, right? So it may sound like it knows exactly what it's talking about, even though it's not actually conscious or thinking in the ways that we think of thinking. And this is one of the tricks. This is one of the things we have to kind of be aware of in how we use it, is it's calculating probabilities, and it's producing an answer that mimics how we talk, but it's not doing this in a conscious way of how I'm talking right now, thinking about the words that come next and how they all fit together. So that's always a thing to be mindful of, is to be critical, because the answer is not a probable answer on the totality of your thought, but a probability of how the words fit together in a pattern that that the AI can also find in its data. And that's a lot of like, I am not a math person, and so I don't like to talk about math because that's very dangerous. And also it can be extremely hard to like fully understand, but ultimately we're dealing with probabilities of language patterns. And that is a very different way than how we think in our heads. So the first thing you really need the first thing you need to really leverage AI well is to have knowledge of what you're asking it, so you can assess the answer. If you don't have such knowledge, then you'll want to make sure your critical analysis skills are front and center in the way you engage with generative AI, in the answers that it gives. But if with that in mind, then it becomes a really interesting tool to help you out in many different ways. I really find it interesting as a dialogue partner, the ability to ask in, to ask it to challenge or reframe or reflect your ideas is in thoughts is really powerful. I see my partner uses it in really great ways to engage with it, to elicit ideas or refine her thinking. In truth, this area is really helpful for all of us when we're trying to figure things out, when we're trying to brainstorm, when we're trying to expand our thinking or look at something differently, and we don't necessarily have the colleagues or mentors or friends to help us out make sense of the ideas out in the world or just in our heads. One of my favorite examples I think about with this is, man, I wish I had this tool when I was in grad school and was reading Michel Foucault. Like, Michel Foucault has lots of deep ideas, and it took me 10 years to read his very small book, History of Sexuality, and the only reason I finally was able to read it was through an audiobook. I would have loved to have a tool like this that I could just like keep asking and asking questions that I was not going to ask in front of other people in my grad program, because I was going to just feel small and ignorant and all of the things that like would make me question, should I be in a graduate program? And so it really does, like, if I could sit there and just keep asking questions and pushing, and it's not even that the answers have to be right, but that they start to help me think in dialogue in a way that is sometimes hard to do outside of a space like this. So generative AI can really be useful as that sounding board to clarify your own ideas or ideas you're trying to figure out. Another way I've really found it helpful is as a task minimizer. So I've started this practice now where anytime I need to do a tedious task, I ask myself, can generative AI help? For instance, every semester, we all have to do this if we are teaching. We have to create a list of dates for the syllabi, right? So rather than toggle back and forth between like a calendar and my syllabus, I just asked ChatGPT now to generate a list of dates in a particular format for every Monday between August to December, and to indicate if and when there are any holidays. That's now a prompt I can use every semester, and it went from a 10-minute task to now a 30-second task. So this is what I mean by task minimizer. I've not eliminated the task, but I have reduced it, and that's where I think we'll be with generative AI, at least for the next few years. Hold on one moment. Sorry. Thank you for that. So another example, I've created a list of all the things that I typically want to do in a day, such as exercise and leisurely read and creatively write. And I gave that list in the rough amount of time that say I want to do those things in a given day. And I've also included the other things that I need to do in a day. And I give it a ChatGPT and I say, okay, here are the things I need and want to do. Create a schedule for me. And it created a 5-day schedule for me. I could then take it one step further and ask it to create that schedule as code for my Google Calendar. And then I could save it as a text file and import it into my calendar. And now it's not just like there as a table, which is useful, but it now is actually sitting, it can sit in my calendar as like, these are actual things that I didn't have to like go and schedule each one every week. And then the other place that I find it really useful kind of in our everyday day-to-day lives and work, myself and others find it's really helpful to, for creating first drafts of things, particularly things that are rhetorically standardized. So if I'm trying to come up with a policy, a feedback form, rubric, instructions around certain processes and the like, I'll use ChatGPT as that first go round, as that first draft, right? It helps to kind of like, oh, where do we start? Like it just gets something. And I may, the final draft may look very, very different, and that's okay. It got me started in moving. Me and a colleague were working to build out some rubrics around this bigger project, and we were doing this last week. We just realized, like, let's have this make the first draft, and then we can refine it. And what that meant was, rather than having an hour-long meeting where we would probably still be stuck on like the second level of the rubric, we had 2 rubrics, and we were working on tweaking them and revising them. So there's this like this way that it really helps get through that first draft and then to be able to build and make sure we can maximize on that like staring at the blank page and starting from nothing. So I've used it also to do things like create job descriptions, coming up with onboarding plans for staff, taking initial goes at creating policies or developing evaluative tools. Lots of different ways that this can kind of help generate that initial draft. And we certainly are seeing at my institution thinking about how it helps us with creating different policies that we're trying to figure out. And especially with tools like Claude, which I had mentioned previously, where I can upload a large text document to provide additional tone and context and information, it can really help in just not just creating to create a first draft that feels grounded in certain context and knowledge. And I think the thing is that we don't always value is that much of our work, even if we love it, there's things we need to do that we either don't like or take longer because we procrastinate or because we dislike it, or it's just clunky to us. And I've been really finding this as a tool in personal work really valuable to move me along quicker or further along and feel more grounded in a project that I'm taking up. Okay, so what about, what should we consider when we keep in mind about AI in work? So some sectors are definitely going to be fast to incorporate generative AI. Others are, in some of these include accounting and graphic design, computer science, communications, in some areas, like in medicine as well. Whereas other places, we're going to see it be a little slower. Health sciences, social work, psychology, and other types of work. I think there's still some significant concern about the ethics and privacy and security. And so I think there's going to be a longer time before we see some of those things manifest. There's promise here for helping folks through things that they struggle with or to quickly get aid and guidance as they need it. And I think about this again a lot as people are onboarded onto work. They can using these tools can kind of bypass a lot of different possible concerns, such as office politics or angst coming across as insufficient, or just feeling like you're being disruptive or too needy, right? When you're that new employee and not wanting to ask too many questions, but also not having enough context. There's lots of ways this tool becomes a really helpful way of like asking more and learning more. And so I think, for right now, there's ways that we are really finding, I am seeing and I am finding it used by others in that really uplifting way of guiding through things that can be tricky and needing that sounding board. I do think we have some concerns about the role of AI in our work coming up. I think in particular, as AI makes us more productive, then there will be this higher expectation about us being productive. And that's going to be this kind of, cycle, that feedback loop that we've seen happening in the past with other technology. It doesn't lessen our work, but now there'll be more work to do. And that's something we have to think about and navigate. But let's take a look actually at some of the possibilities with AI in the job search process. I think this is where you can really start to see some of the cool things that it can do. So one of the things that I appreciate about it is that it can help me and others prepare for new challenges that might be less familiar to us, or help us hone in on things that we're uncertain about. So in the job search, I've used it to review a job description and a resume to more effectively help the job seeker apply for a position. So it might mean polishing up the resume or clarifying the cover letter or making some stronger connections between one's past and the role they are applying for. I've also seen folks use some context in the job description to generate what are the most likely questions they will face in an interview. Right, so asking ChatGPT to help generate questions, and even answer those questions and get feedback from ChatGPT about those answers. I think for me, as we get into this, the thing that I appreciate most about generative AI is that it can often open up the hidden curriculum of the world for people that are applying and trying to like figure out different systems. I think that's one of the coolest things about it. And the example I love to go to is the cover letter. So for me, the cover letter, and I don't mean this may be a hot take, but for me, it is the most trite piece of writing ever. It's a very rhetorically loaded piece of writing that requires an applicant to, I mean, supplicate themselves to the employer in the hopes of an interview. And it's highly loaded and it's subject to cultural and gendered and racist interpretations. And the thing is, like in the vast majority of jobs, the way and what and how you write the cover letter often has very little to do with the job that you're applying for. Um, and I say this as somebody who like writes pretty good cover letters, given my history of like getting interviews for jobs. So the fact that people can now use a mixture of the job description, their resume to largely craft a cover letter and save them a tremendous amount of time, angst, energy, frustration, I think is really great. Whether folks are multi-language learners, neurodiverse, dyslexic, or just struggle, a lot with writing about themselves in that particular rhetorical expected form in the cover letter, I see generative AI as a tool that can help job seekers, that can really kind of level those things out. And we'll see what some of those prompts are shortly. So I just want to kind of give a highlight to that and emphasize how valuable this is. Because often what it reveals is things that I had just not considered or realized. Sometimes it's offering something that isn't necessarily true as I get feedback or as I use it, but it is capturing things I hadn't necessarily thought of or realized in how to frame that. And that has improved my own thinking about the value I offer, whether it's in my current work or whether I'm doing an annual evaluation or requesting a promotion or just advocating for improvements, improved working conditions. So I think this is where it really generates its value. It gives us language. It gives us different ways of understanding some of the things that we're doing. So how does it show up in this job search? There's lots of different options here to explore. There's three really big ways that we're seeing it used. One is unpacking our own skills and abilities. So that is getting a sense of what your own abilities are is tricky for most of us. And so leveraging generative AI as a self-discovery tool is really, really key here. Anticipating the needs and expectations of your work. So being able to create composites within different roles or industries rather than sifting through endless searches online is going to more calcify your understanding of work in certain areas. And then building that bridge from you to that work and figuring out the different strategies and ways of representing your work and how it aligns with what you seek is the real kind of like clinch piece of generative AI. So again, here, lots of different ways you can use this. If you go into the slide deck, you'll see I'll have lots of different prompts for many of these. So you can use it to kind of understand the role specs within a job, within a specific industry. You can use it to develop your target list of businesses or organizations you want to work for, helping with your digital professional portfolio, doing company reconnaissance, your cover letter, interview prep. I've seen people use it for employee offer negotiations. So once you get the offer, using it as a way to like figure out exactly what you would want to say or frame your response. So here's an example of a prompt, right? So in this prompt, I'm asking ChatGPT to help build out a plan for my target list of companies, as if I was a student, might want to keep in my focus for employment. And so in the dialogue, I come up with both the steps and industries to further explore. So by entering this prompt, I can get a really rich response. And just to kind of clarify, I'm saying, you're a job. I'm telling ChatGPT you're a job and internship planning expert. Advise a student to come up with their target list. It should be relevant, achievable, and not too many places. Should put it in an output of table form, and that should include the step, the estimated time of the estimated duration of time, how long it will take, an example of what that step would look like. And those examples should be drawn from different industries. Right, so this is a prompt that I put in, and again, the full response will be in the annotated bibliography, sorry, that annotated slide deck. But this is what it produced, right? So it gave me exactly what I asked for. It produced this table. It told me what is the step for each. What is each step? What does that look like? And what would it look like in a particular industry? So I can always follow up and expand and ask more questions, right? I think it gave me 10 steps, but like I can always ask more questions. I can ask for more details, ask for it to really delve into some of these pieces for further investigation. And I think this is the thing that's always important to remember with ChatGPT is that it's less powerful as a one-off and more powerful as a dialogue. More powerful to get answers, respond, and give additional context and get additional context. So here's another one, matching skills, right? So in this case, again, I'm telling it act as an expert job and skills analyzer, provide feedback, no less than 5 skills, provide an explanation of how that skill is demonstrated, why that skill is important, or invaluable in the field of instructional design. So I use this as a particular example. You would replace instructional design with whatever your field is. And then I gave it a scenario. Here's my experience thus far. And if I wanted to become an instructional designer, like what would that look like? So once again, asked it for a table and it spit out, well, you identified these skills. Here's how it was demonstrated. Here's why it's important for this particular field. So this becomes again, that idea of really being able to identify what it is that I've done and how that relates to the thing that I want to do. I think is really powerful to really help students with, to really guide their thinking and make sure they feel like they have the language to work with or to communicate with the places that they're trying to pivot to. I think this is the final one. This one was, I really like this one. This is, I'm interviewing for a job. I want here's the job description. Provide a list of 20 distinct and significant questions. Rate each question on a 10 scale of its likeliness of being asked. For each question, provide an explanation and 2 to 3 points to highlight one, 2 or 3 points to highlight in one's answer. Put it in a table. So once again, here's the question. Here's the likelihood. Here's the reason. Here's how to respond. And what's fun about this, or what's really helpful to be thinking about and working with students and the like, sorry, I was just seeing in the chat, like you tell it to put it in a table and it really helps make sense of the information. The likelihood is a really interesting question. And I could then turn around and be like, okay, here would be my answer to the first question. Like rate me on a 10 score, or give me feedback about how I can improve it, or how I should have more clarity, or what is less confusing. Right. So this is where I see it used in really fascinating, productive ways that I think can be really helpful. And there's lots of different prompts like this, again, throughout that annotated slide deck. So what makes a good prompt, right? So that if you've been listening, I've been talking about this idea of prompts are really helpful in providing guidance to the actual to the output, right? Because if we don't give it really good guidance, it's going to just kind of give us answers that are very weak. And that's a lot of people's initial experience is, oh, I went to ChatGPT, I asked it a question, like write me an essay on Kate Chopin's The Awakening. And it gave me a really weak essay on Kate Chopin's The Awakening. And there's a good reason for that. Like there wasn't enough information and details to elicit the best response. So some of the things that are really important is context and details. You have to provide it with a deeper sense of what you're trying to do. You do this by front loading useful pieces of information, whether it's a job description, whether it's your, pieces of information about you, etc. But you really have to provide it that context. It's helpful to use the term act as, or you are a specialist or something like that, because that seems to fine tune and focus the AI model to draw upon differently ranked data and to get better quality data. So act as a job recruiter, act as a hiring agent at company X, and like should be more helpful, should produce better results. Framing the results, as you saw, is like when I say put it in a table, but it can come up in other ways. You know, if it's a cover letter, you might ask it for a professional but lighthearted tone, or you might ask it to, create it as I mentioned with the calendar, like create it as a code so I can put it into my calendar. But be very clear about how you want the information to come out, or the approach you want the information, or the style. An underrated tool around this is, if you go back and you look at some of the prompts, I actually ask ChatGPT to ask me questions to get clarity, right? So if I'm not always sure what's the information that I need to give it, I can always tell it, like, interview me until you have what you feel is sufficient information, right? So sometimes, you don't know what questions to ask, and so you can actually start it in reverse of having it interview you. And finally, as I mentioned, iterate on past prompts. Recognize that if you're in a thread within many of these tools, everything that's come before in that thread is also informing its answers. So see this as an ongoing dialogue. See this as, okay, if I've given it additional information, that's going to play a part in this. So think about this always as iteratively. Think of it as like you're having this ongoing conversation that is drawing upon both the past of what you've said and the other things that it's elicited from its model. And so then finally, collect examples. As you find prompts that you find really useful and helpful, definitely make use of them, right? So one of the things that you're already off to a good start is that you have a bunch of prompts already through the resources in this presentation. They are resources that you are welcome to use. They're covered by, as I said, a Creative Commons license, and they can help you build out that like collection of like, ooh, this could be really useful, or I could tweak this. And the thing is the prompts themselves aren't perfect. It's more the thinking about how it's asking and you're eliciting information and giving information in order for that response from generative AIs to be more improved. And then finally, we've taken this brief tour of generative AI, what it can do. It's time to also just recognize some of the concerns that we want to acknowledge and be aware of in how we use these tools. So the privacy of these tools, it leaves much to be desired. It remains unclear with some of the tools exactly how much you put into it is to be held by them, both for training data and for later reuse in some way. And while it won't necessarily reproduce in the exact same way that we think of reproduce, because again, we're dealing with probabilistic relationships, you're still putting content in there that you want to be aware of and think about in terms of privacy. So often I'd be hesitant to put anything in there that is my own writing or work that I intend to show up in other places. Along those lines, it's incredibly important to be careful with putting other people's information or work into these tools, since it may be, there may be issues of privacy or copyright being violated. We have the deeper and serious questions that I don't have any answers for and grapple with myself every time I think, talk, or write about using generative AI. What does it mean to use the tools that are, these tools that have problematic implications for the world we live in? I mean, we already know there's problems with cars and phones, and we know that, and we at different times are comfortable or not comfortable with it. But at the forefront of this technology, from the get-go, we've known more than others that its use relies on certain things that feel harmful, whether it's abusing copyright or employing people in global south to do content moderation for a few dollars an hour, to climate impact of energy use to run generative AI. There are serious concerns about using the tool and how it will and does hurt other people. As I said, there's no good answer here, because history shows us that such things don't necessarily stop us from perpetuating that harm. Yet I would charge each of us to think and to sit with it a little bit and be curious about why you are or aren't okay with it. I know it will be incredibly hard because we live in a world that will continue to have us move forward regardless. And so, where do you sit with that, and why? And then there's also the question, and I think this is probably a big question for everybody here, is figuring out the appropriate level of help. Um, right? We're all working with students. They are adults, and they also have so many pressing issues. And also, we can feel like uncomfortable or feel challenged by how they might be using it. We want it to help, but we don't want it to become the replacement of what they are doing. So it can be really easy to lean heavily on a tool such as this, and to do a lot of the work to get the job. And there's some places within the process that it makes sense, but you don't want to be like wantonly accepting and using the tool without thought and intention. And so, how do we help them think about always wanting to be thinking about in reviewing its outputs to see if those outputs genuinely reflect them, in their work, in their voice? Because that tool can be really helpful in the process, but it can't necessarily replace when they're potentially interviewing or when they show up to work, and the inconsistencies between how they showed up in that interview process and how they show up in the work may have some downstream effects. So a few guiding questions: how does this AI output reflect me, and where does it not properly reflect who I am? So these would be really good questions to be working with students around. How accurate is the content of this output, and how can I verify or validate what it's saying? Would a friend or colleague who read the AI output that I'm about to use feel like it reflects the person they know? And then what aspects within this process of securing a job do I need to be fully in control or more comfortable with? And so with that, I would love to turn to questions. And I think I see there's some in the chat, maybe. I see some in the chat, so I'm gonna start with those, if that makes sense. So I have one person asking, are all of these AI platforms only proficient in English, or are they equally capable of managing other languages like Spanish or French, or others, or even translations? My understanding is, I don't know, I wouldn't say they are equally capable, but I do know that multi-language learners have been using them for English translation. So that's about the best I can answer that. I think different tools, like I could imagine Google probably does, because Google has such a wide vast of access to language. I don't know as much about ChatGPT. Do we know what happens? And so another person asks, do we know what happens with the text in terms of confidentiality, and let's say trying to use to synthesize ideas for products that would be considered of limited circulation and work? That's a really good question. There's not an exact clear answer, except that ChatGPT has been increasingly allowing or creating certain privacy if you have a professional account or an enterprise account. I also know early on it was Amazon, and maybe it was Fidelity. There was a couple different companies that reached out to their employees and said, you need to stop using ChatGPT, because some of their proprietary information, such as code, started to show up in ChatGPT. And so this is one of the reasons why, that the confidentiality piece, particularly in higher ed, I wouldn't actually use anything confidential with any AI tool unless they actually had a agreement with the institution, because there's we don't know to the degree that we don't know. And unless we have had our IT, your institutional IT folks approve it, then like we leave ourselves open to, privacy concerns, FERPA concerns, things like that. So I would always err on the side of caution around confidential information around this. I think that can definitely set up a situation that could leave somebody vulnerable, intentionally or not. And I see there's now more in the chat, so let me grab those. What employer feedback have you heard on AI generated resume? So this is from Nicole. What employer feedback have you heard on AI generated resume or cover letter content? So some employers are trying to go the route of like getting an AI checker, an AI plagiarism checker. That is a really bad route to go, because those are tools that are just not really good, and they probably won't be good for a very long time. And so most of the results around AI plagiarism checker, well, they come up with false positives. So companies will be positively identifying people that used AI that didn't. And within that population, the people who are impacted most are multi-language learners. So people who English may not be their primary language. So it creates this new bias towards folks who actually did nothing wrong, but are learning a language, and are learning a language in a very stylistic way, to kind of, as we typically learn language, in very formatted ways that are all of a sudden pinging these AI checkers as being a bot. Outside of that, I think what I've seen and heard is like, there's sometimes it feels really evident, and so those are going to get dismissed. Sometimes people leave I am just an AI bot. Sometimes people don't use it effectively. Like if they're not using it smartly, I think that can be very evident. Just like really generic cover letters can be really evident. Beyond that, I don't know that I've heard a lot about what if they're used. I think the answer is, if they're using it ineffectively, I hear employers, very upset about that and feeling like, oh, they're just calling it in. If they're using it really well, employers aren't going to know. And I think that's the interesting challenge or consideration there. Let's see, a couple other questions I'm seeing here in the chat, and I'll just stop sharing my screen. We can see each other now. So a couple other things in here. Sorry. So students have shared uploading a job description in their resume to create a cover letter. Would you recommend they don't upload their resume with phone number, email, for confidentiality reasons? I think that's a great question. I think I would avoid phone number, because phone numbers are our modern day social security, right? Your number is tied to all sorts of parts of your identity. But email, I feel less threatened by, because I just assume our emails are in so many databases at this point. I mean, our phone numbers are too, but email less so. But I think, given the nature of, let me put it this way, if the person is particularly concerned about privacy, no. But if the person is particularly concerned about privacy, I think there's a lot of different places they're not going to be going or using. If they are somebody who is also already on LinkedIn with all of their information there in different ways, then I would have a different answer and say, like, I don't necessarily see it being hurt, that person being hurt in some way, because that person, a lot of that information is already out there in lots of different places. Do you have any feelings about paid versus free, and how that will create future inequalities? I don't think it will, as much as at least right now, I don't think it will, right? Because some of the paid versions, like I do pay for the advanced version of ChatGPT. I know I could get much of the same answers if I used Bing's creative output, because Bing's creative output is runs on ChatGPT 4. So like, you can adjust some of the settings in Bing in its AI tool, So, and honestly, I think with Google, they're increasingly putting things out there much more quickly to people who are using Google products. So I don't think it's going to stress digital divides and techno capital any more than the structures we already have in place that uh, that maintain those inequalities. I guess would be my answer, and that is an answer that definitely has a shelf life. And I would say revisit within a year, and I might feel differently. Other questions? Throw the resource in the chat one more time in case for folks that jumped in later. Oop, Michelle beat me to it. Great minds. Is everybody over on ChatGPT just typing in answers, trying to find out if how much of my presentation was generated by ChatGPT? I promise none of it was.
Much, Lance. And I know the resource document has lots more details. I had no idea that the prompts could be so complex and so specific. So that actually looks like a thing to learn. But thank you for raising a lot of the depth behind this. I think some of us too are just sort of jumping in and typing and things like that. So you've raised a lot of background context and issues to consider. And thank you all attendees for these good questions as well. This is really, I think, generating more interest and curiosity and homework
Yep.
for us to experiment with. So I really appreciate your expertise. I appreciate the resource document and giving us an excellent context here. So thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And yeah, going in and just starting to play with it, trying to find a newsletter or two that's giving you updates about what it is, I think is going to really be important, because your students are going to be using it if they aren't already, and there's going to be an expectation of using it in work. I have trouble believing. I know there's industries that are starting to use this more proactively, so just making sure our students are prepared for that is a really important piece. So thank you all so much. Feel free to send follow-up questions and have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks so much, Lance.